Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 8. Succession and Strife. In the year 94 of the Common Reckoning, Gortar, king of the Skeldings, died. He had lived for 90 years and ruled the Skeldings for 59 of them. After Gortar's body had been burned and the feasting, drinking and mourning had been completed, the captains of the Skeldings met in the great hall of Skeld to decide who should replace him as their king. Originally there had been 50 captains, the captains of the ships of Skeld the Stormblown. The title of captain was hereditary, being bestowed on the senior descendant of each of those captains, with preference being given to the male line. But over time some of those families had become extinct and some had been united by marriage. The number of captains had therefore dwindled and by this time was reduced to 37. Gortar had been a good king, and the captains quickly agreed that the kingship should be passed to one of his descendants. Gortar had fathered 6 sons. 4 of these had predeceased him. The eldest of those that survived him was Grimbold, the warden of Overwater, and several of the captains championed his claim. But Grimbold was not a captain. Following Gortar's death, that title had passed to his grandson, Godric, and it was Godric that the captains selected as their monarch. King Godric summoned Grimbold to Great Hall. Grimbold knelt before Godric, and Godric confirmed Grimbold as Warden of Overwater. The captains' lands were all clustered around Great Hall, where the Skeldings had first settled in Halfland. But since that original settlement, the Skeldings had significantly extended their territory. There were several families in those new territories who had more extensive landholdings and wealth than many of the captains, and felt that they should have a say in selecting the king. Grimbold suggested to Godric that this was potentially a cause of future discontent, and that the heads of the most powerful of these families should be awarded the title of captain, to bring the number of captains back up to 50. Godric thanked Grimbold for his counsel, and promised Grimbold that he would follow this advice. However, the existing captains did not want their power to be diluted, and after Grimbold had returned to Overwater, it was they who had Godric's ear. Godric procrastinated, and his promise was not made good. In the year 95 of the Common Reckoning, Harnan, the king of New Lixia, died. Harnan had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The son was called Alcon, and he married Athis, who was famous for her luxuriant eyelashes. The couple had but one child, a son, Casos, who was born in the year 68 of the Common Reckoning. But Casos was born fatherless. While celebrating his wife's pregnancy, Alcon had imbibed rather too freely, fallen into the harbour, and drowned. Casos was the apple of his mother's eye, and Athis doted on him. She would not let him out of her sight, and prohibited him from any activity that might be dangerous. As a result, he became enormously overweight. In the famously hot summer of the year 80 of the Common Reckoning, he died of heat stroke, aged only 12. Harnan therefore had no surviving direct male descendants, and so the kingship passed to his great-nephew Selapos, the eldest son of Siramos, the eldest son of Dagnos, who was Harnan's younger brother. I have told the story of that branch of the family elsewhere. After his escape from the daughters of Iris, Selapos had married Dotto, who was famously gentle and kindly and generous to the poor. This endeared her to the people, and the coronation of Seleucus was therefore a cause of much rejoicing. Unlike the Skeldings and the New Lixians, the dwarvish territories did not see such peaceful transitions of power. But, given the nature of dwarves, maybe that is not surprising. In the year 97 of the Common Reckoning, Borgar, king of the dwarves of the Dark Hills, died. He left behind a wife, Ursa, and 2 children, a son, Botolf, aged 7, and a daughter, Asta, of 6 years. With the support of his uncle, Bygarth, who acted as regent, Botolf was crowned in his father's place. Boddi, the Earl of Unnascrag, was summoned to the Hillhold to swear allegiance to the new king, but Boddi refused. He was not prepared to bend the knee to his own great nephew, a mere child, and saw an opportunity to make Unnascrag a fully sovereign state, with Boddi as its sovereign. Bygarth was not prepared to let this act of defiance go unchallenged. He knew that if Boddi was successful in ignoring the edicts of the new king, others would be emboldened to do likewise, and Bygarth's power and his nephew's throne would be lost. He therefore mustered his troops and readied them to march on Unnascrag. Boddi had considered this possibility. He had been in correspondence with his son-in-law, Hunwulf, the Lord of Dwarfbridge, requesting military assistance. Hunwulf had replied that, in light of the threat posed to Dwarfbridge by the Skelding forces based at Overwater, he could not spare any fighting dwarves at present. But he had sent his brother Orm to Geitspin, where his cousin Ranveig sat upon the throne of the Geitsmark, ruling jointly with her husband Hammond. No love was lost between the dwarves of the Geitsmark and those of the Hillhold, although those lands were at peace. And, while King Hammond and Queen Ranveig were not themselves prepared to break that peace, they were happy for Orm to do so. And so Orm raised his standard and marched through the Geitsmark, proclaiming that he was going to make war on the dwarves of the Dark Hills, and that any who wished could join him and share in the loot. Many of the dwarves of the Geitsmark flocked to his banners. Having gathered an army to him, Orm marched it toward the Hillhold. Thus, rather than marching south to Unnascrag to bring Boddi to heel, Bygarth had to march his army north to deal with the threat posed by Orm. The 2 forces met at the village of Bleakbrook, and Orm had the victory. Bygarth and the remnants of his shattered army fled back to the Hillhold, where Bygarth learned that Boddi had raised an army and was marching north. This caused Bygarth much consternation, and he urged Botolf the child king and Ursa the king's mother to flee. But Ursa refused. She told Bygarth that when a silly young girl is out walking at night and a bat flies into her hair, she screams and runs away. Botolf might be a child, but he was not so easily scared. He was a king and the son of a king, and he would act like a king. Bygarth muttered something about the only bats being in Ursa's belfry and headed eastward, accompanied by a small band of loyal retainers. Between the great mountains of Lordsgrave and Maidesbarrow rose the river Ravenshead, which flowed south through the Dark Hills before turning to the east and ultimately discharging into the Great River. Within the last decade or so, the dwarves of the Dark Hills had begun to colonise the hills to the east of the river Ravenshead, and the most notable of the colonists was Brodir. Now Brodir was the youngest son of Bodolf. He was therefore Boddi's brother, Bygarth's uncle, and King Botolf's great-uncle. But Brodir was not interested in power or politics, or indeed in people. He sought solitude, and had found it on the frontier, where dwarvish cultivation faded into the untamed wilderness. It was to these lands that Bygarth fled. Brodir heard news of his coming, and this caused Brodir concern. Bygarth might well be pursued by his enemies, and Brodir would be expected to take sides, and this would disturb Brodir's peace. Brodir had no wish to be disturbed, and he decided to forestall any commotion. So, as Bygarth and his small band of followers journeyed east, Brodir and his dwarves fell upon them. But Brodir's stratagem did not work as he had anticipated. It was Bygarth who triumphed, and Brodir who was slain. Bygarth did not take any comfort from his victory. Instead, he took it as confirmation that his enemies lurked behind every bush, and he could find no safety in the environs of the dark hills. And so he headed north, up the river Ravenshead, and into the passes between Lordsgrave and Maid's-Barrow. This was a remote road, and a hard one. The passes were high and rugged. Even at the height of summer, snow lay on the ground up here, and it was now autumn, and the weather was not kind to Bygarth. But he and his companions successfully crossed the mountain passes, and tired, bedraggled, and half-starving, staggered down from the mountains into the hill country, and so into South Vale. A couple of days after Bygarth had left the hill-hold, Boddi and his army arrived. Boddi arrayed his host in ranks in the fields below, and strode up the hillside toward the gate, alone except for one companion who carried a flag of truce. 100 yards from the gate he halted, sat on the grass, and waited. All was silent, and then the gate opened, and Ursa walked through it, holding the hand of Botolf, who walked beside her. "So, Earl Boddi," she said, "your war dog Orm ravages and plunders the king's subjects in the north. Have you come here to protect your king and his lands, to fight for the crown to which you own your title? Or do you come here as a traitor to make war on your rightful king, to make war on women and children, to make war on your own kindred?" Boddi looked up at her. He did not stand. "I had to defend myself," he said. "Bygarth was preparing to make war on me." "Bygarth is not here," replied Ursa. "There is no longer any question of his making war on anybody. But the king still commands sufficient spear dwarves to defend the hill-hold, if you seek to take it by force." "Is there another way to take it?" enquired Boddi. "Rise to your feet," replied Ursa, "and then kneel before your king. Kiss the king's hand and swear fealty to him. Send Orm and his vultures home, and then rule the hill-hold and all of the dwarves of the dark hills in the king's name. I see no other path to peace." Boddi rose slowly to his feet. He bowed to Ursa, and then he knelt before Botolf and kissed his hand. Orm won much fame by his victory at the Battle of Bleakbrook. He and his followers marched back to the Geitsmark, driving herds of cattle before them, and followed by a baggage train full of plunder. But As he triumphantly marched into Geitspin, he found a messenger awaiting him. His brother Hunwulf was seriously ill, and Orm was needed at Dwarfbridge. The following year, being 98 of the common reckoning, Hunwulf died. He left a wife and children behind him, but his eldest child, Halvard, was only 9 years old. The dwarves of Dwarfbridge were not sentimental folk. The Skeldings continued to pose an imminent threat, and the dwarves needed a proven warrior to lead them, not a 9-year-old boy. And so, by popular acclaim, Orm became Lord of Dwarfbridge. More than 10 years previously, Hastein had ordered the dwarves of Dwarfbridge to practice each week with crossbow or spear. This edict had continued in force during the rule of Hunwulf. Thus, although the population of Dwarfbridge was small, it possessed considerable martial prowess. While his predecessors had taken a defensive stance, Orm preferred to take the initiative. It seemed inevitable that, sooner or later, the Skeldings would resume their drive northwards. Why wait and fight the Skeldings at a time of their choosing, when they were prepared and ready for war? Better to attack now, take the Skeldings by surprise, and fight the war in their territory. That way there would be plunder and booty for Orm, and if he could re-establish the halflings in Overwater and the country to the south, that would not only provide more of a buffer zone between the Skeldings and Dwarfbridge, but also reopen trade in that direction. After all, the halflings would have a lot of rebuilding to do, and the dwarves would be very happy to sell them the tools with which to do it. So, in the year 99 of the common reckoning, Orm led a combined army of dwarves and halflings in an attack on Overwater. He achieved complete surprise. Overwater was once more looted and burned, and those of its inhabitants who survived fled southwards. Among those survivors were Grimbold and his wife, and 4 of his 5 children, but not his eldest daughter, Enfleda, who perished in the flames. She was 12 years old. Orm paused in Overwater for a few days. He spent this time pillaging the countryside and sending wagons back to Dwarfbridge laden with the spoils, and then he marched south. Grimbold spent this time sending riders through all the Skelding lands to the west of the Silver Stream, summoning the Skeldings to his banner, gathering his forces. And then he marched north. But that story is for next time.